My name is Grant McCarty, and I am a local foods and small farms educator with the University of Illinois Extension. And today we are going to be talking about hops production and marketing hops for, or I guess growing hops for market. So to get us going, just a little bit about me. I'm a local foods educator that works in Joe Davis, Stevenson, and Winnebago counties. This is in the northwest corridor, as we call it, of northwest Illinois, right on the Wisconsin border. Um, I was fortunate to come to this position about a year and a half ago, and was also fortunate to have a number of hops growers in this area, these three counties. So we just kind of fell into the hops production, if you will. That being said, I've developed a couple of hops programs such as Hops U, which we call an introduction to growing hops for market. And also we have a Hops U production course called Variety Selection, Irrigation, and Soil Nutrient Management. Today's webinar is going to be a combination of both of these programs, plus a little bit more information that we've kind of gleaned in the last year. Additionally, we have a hops field day that we had in summer 2014 with a hops farm in Stevenson County. And we also will have an additional hops field day in summer 2015, so kind of be on the lookout for that. I also am a member of the Great Lakes Hops Working Group, and this is a group of extension professionals, university researchers from Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, Indiana. We also include North Carolina, Vermont, and some other states. And the idea behind this working group is just kind of figure out what the best practices are for the hops growers within our states, along with being able to supply each other with information of disease issues, pest issues, variety selection, and variety issues. So it's been a very beneficial group to be a part of. So with that in mind, here's what today's outline is going to look like. We'll do a general hops overview of what hops plants are, what the cones are, where is the state of hop production within the U.S., where is it within the rest of the states as well. And then we also kind of get into what the cones are. What do the cones look like? How are they processed? What do you need to consider when you're growing these? The photo you see here is the actual cones themselves, and are responsible for the yields that are used in the brewing process. With that, we also will talk about choosing the variety. It's very important when it comes to selecting your hops plants that you want to grow to choose a variety based on different kinds of characteristics. And we'll get into a little bit of what you need to consider when choosing a variety. Because unlike other plants where you might be able to, they have different colors, different taste quality, different appearances, sizes, different shapes. Most of the hops plants you see all look the same. The difference is strictly with a couple of different compounds within the cones themselves. Furthermore, we'll talk about establishing the hops within the hops yard, the management practices you need to consider, and then we also will get into some of the trellising system designs, especially if you're looking at getting to above 1 acre, even upwards of 5 acres. You really are dependent on having that good trellis system in place. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about the harvest, how you need to harvest, when you need to harvest, and how you need to get your cones ready in order to sell them at market or sell them to home brewers or small-scale breweries in your area. So what we've seen in the last couple of years is that there's a high demand for hops. And a lot of this is coming from the home brewers in the area. It's also coming from these small microbreweries that are popping up. These are ones that don't always need as much hop cones as some of the larger operations and larger breweries in other areas do. So they're ones that you can work with because they a home brewer may just need 2 to 3 pounds of hop cones, or maybe a small microbrewery needs maybe 5 to 7 pounds of hops for a particular recipe, compared to large-scale breweries who can sometimes need between 200 to 300 pounds of dry hops for a particular recipe. So that's kind of where we see the ability for you as a hops grower to really kind of fill this need from home brewers and breweries in the area. We also see a lot of growing trend for having local hops. There's a lot of great connections that can be made by growing hops that can then be transformed by a local brewery in your hometown or with the home brewers in your area as well. We also are fortunate to be where we're at in the state of Illinois, where hops really need upwards of 15 hours of sunlight, especially during the growing season in June and July. And we get upwards of that. And it's all particularly tied to the 45th parallel line geographically. So below the 45th parallel line, we start to lose some sunlight, and it can adversely affect yields. Not to say, by being kind of close to this line, we're getting a great amount of sunlight to really get great yields. We're also seeing other Midwestern states that have now kind of tried to recapitalize on growing interest in hops. This includes Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, all three of which have been very proactive when it comes to hop research and variety trials, as well as hops education, and looking at some of the intricacies involved with growing hops in the Midwest. At the same time, we also are in an area where, while we might have disease and pest problems such as downy or powdery mildew or aphids and spider mites, we don't have as much of a problem with them as some of the other parts of the U.S. does. Particularly some of the southern states who are growing hops run into downy and powdery mildew each season due to their climate. So we're kind of in a fortunate area where sometimes these problems can persist, but they're not as problematic as they can be for other parts of the United States that want to grow hops. In general, the U.S. produces under about 1/3 of the world's hops. And with that, about most of it's coming from Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. States in the Midwest who are growing hops, the acres tend to vary. I believe it is in Illinois, we have about 15 acres or so throughout the state. Wisconsin has about 60 to 75, although that number sometimes can fluctuate. We also have in Minnesota about 10 to 25 acres of hops. Whereas out in these states, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, there's really, large-scale hops production occurring. With that, the states combined to produce about 61.2 million pounds of dry hops in 2012. At the same time, 77% of that's coming from the Yakima Valley region in Washington. What's interesting to note about Yakima Valley is it is a desert-like condition with desert-like climate. So when you think about some of the varieties that are going to grow well out there, they may not grow as well out here in our Midwest conditions. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind when you're deciding on the varieties that you want to grow in your hop yard. As far as the general plant, hops are a perennial plant. It's the annual vines that come off of them that have the cones, and it's the cones that are actually used in that brewing process. So each year, once you establish your perennial hop plant in year one, it's going to send out these vines, and you need to trellis them some way so that you can get good cone yields. The hops plant is purchased a rhizome, and this is going to be producing the buds in the springtime. And really, the hops rhizome and the hops plant is going to be fully mature in 3 years. So really, those first 2 years are very important as far as establishing that rhizome and giving it kind of the energy and the growth that it needs, so that by year 3 you can get a good hop harvest off of it. So it's really important, as I'll talk on later today, to be very mindful of your soil nutrients and giving the plant everything that it needs. At the same time, as I've talked about just now, cones are the harvested part, and these are the ones that are used in the actual brewing process. You also have two different types of hops. You have what we call the bittering hops, or we have the aromatic. And that's going to be very important when it comes to choosing your variety, because based on it being a bittering hop or aromatic one, that will then decide how the hops can be used for certain beer recipes. And that will also help you kind of bridge the gap and be able to go and talk to home brewers or go and talk to microbrewers in the area and kind of see what variety they need, and whether they need a bittering hop or whether they need that aromatic hop. So in these two photos, you can get a better idea of what the hops plant rhizome looks like. This photo on the left, you can see the brown rhizome with the vines coming off of it. And this is typically, this obviously has been removed from the field and it's a couple years old at this point, but you can see what it starts to look like. When you plant that brown part of the rhizome into the ground, the green shoots are what's coming out of it. And it's these green shoots that then are going to give you your cones. I'll touch about later on today, but you typically are choosing between 2 to 3 of these vines. You'll note that there's a number of vines on there that are coming out of that rhizome in the springtime, but you're going to go for 2 to 3 of the most vigorous ones, and then the rest will then be pruned and removed. The opposite photo then is what it will look like at harvest time. As the vines begin to grow up, they begin to uh, grow clockwise around the twine that you have in your operation. They will start to produce cones at the side. And the cones are the ones that you will then harvest and sell to home brewers, to breweries in your area, or even use in your own home. So here you can see actually in the field what the hops plant looks like in the spring. As the growth starts happening, all of these shoots begin to come out of it, and then you're choosing 2 to 3 of them, the most vigorous ones. Most of the time you also want to wait till you get a couple that are about a foot in length, and then from there you'll remove the other ones that you don't want to use. So here's a photo from North Carolina State, which has a hops variety trial program for the last couple of years. And you can see here what a traditional hops yard looks like. They're obviously about a little bit into their season just based on the height of those hops vines being about 4 to 5 feet. You can also see that they all are connected with a trellis system too. You can also see too that this trellis system is pretty tall, and that's one thing you have to consider with hops, is that many of them can get upwards of 30 feet depending on the time of season. So you have to be very mindful of giving them a trellis system that they can really grow up on, so that they can yield and perform to the best of their abilities. You also see within the design of this yard is that there is space between each rows. And typically the spacing is going to be about 8 feet. You'll also note that in this situation they have bare ground for their hop yard, but that's not always the case. Sometimes we see grass in between the rows, sometimes we also see cover crops. But in essence, this is what some of the traditional hop yard looks like. You'll note that you're utilizing telephone poles or some other wooden pole system in order to hold the hop vines on there as they're growing. And you also kind of see a little bit of a faint steel trellis line further down the row. So this is more of a grid system than some of the traditional hop yards that you see, especially in the Midwest and the Northwest. So here's what you should expect to see as your hops are growing. So they begin later on in the season, around July, to start forming those cones. You can kind of see in this picture especially, they are just kind of opening up and then they eventually are going to close into their cone form. And then from there, at a certain time during the season, which I'll talk about the harvest, you would then pick them and then would utilize them as wet cones, or utilize them as dry cones, where you actually are kind of drying them out in order to store them or utilize them later on for beer recipes. So here's another photo from North Carolina State, a very similar design as we saw in the previous photo. You can also see this is very much later on in the growing season where the hops are really putting on a lot of growth. You'll also note there's a V design, and that's particularly important, especially as we talked about choosing 2 to 3 of the best shoots. You also will then want to kind of keep them from being tangled. So you can see kind of this first row of hops plants that each side of the V is particularly just one hops vine going up the trellis system. And this allows them to have good air circulation, so it can keep them from spreading powdery and downy mildew. It also allows you to maybe do any more management style that you need to do, such as doing any kind of pruning, getting in there with any type of watering system. But it's a system approach, this V shape, that kind of allows for sometimes better maintenance. You don't always have to do the V shape. In fact, this is what works well for North Carolina, but we don't always see it in other states. A lot of times we just see that singular row of hops down a row. And I have photos of that you'll see later on today. So some other things to consider. Obviously, they're going to be established in the spring. So when you order your hops rhizomes or your plant, you'll plant these in the spring and then kind of train and trellising as needed. As I touched on, those first 2 years are really critical for building that rhizome and giving the rhizome everything that it needs. Sometimes I hear people who say, well, we put it out in year 1 and we got a little bit of growth up to maybe 2 or 3 feet, and that was about it. Whereas other people say, well, that first 2 years, it was going all the way up to 15 to 20 feet. And really, a lot of times, that's sometimes very seasonal. There's a lot of seasonal variation with that. But what I want to let you know, though, is that you shouldn't expect to get any yield those first 2 years. As you can see there, I mean, we expect less than 20 ounces of cones off of your rhizome, off of your plant, because really the energy is being sent to establish that rhizome. This, of course, can depend a lot on other things. So it's dependent on the variety, it's dependent on the soil conditions that you have, any of your soil fertility, along with the irrigation system that you may have in place. That 3rd year, you should start to see kind of what your yearly average is going to be from here on out. Typically, you're going to get maybe 1/2 to 2 pounds of wet cones off of that singular rhizome, and sometimes that can, as I say, really depend on the variety, environmental conditions. It can also depend on where the plant is in its development by year 3 too. Not mentioned on this slide is that hops plants can last sometimes between 15 to 20 years. So it's very crucial to kind of spend those first 2 years based on those first 2 years really zeroing in on establishing it. You also harvest cones in late summer, and the way that you do that is you actually remove the vines at the base of the rhizome, and then you will cut it at the top of your trellis as well. And then from there, you'll be picking it by hand. There is small-scale machinery to pick hop cones. You send the vines through this machinery. However, it can be very expensive, and unless you are in have a very large-scale hops production, your best bet for harvesting is kind of picking by hand and cutting the vines down. So the cones are what's used for the actual brewing. And you can see in this cone, when you break it up, are these yellow powder that's called the lupulin glands. Within the lupulin glands, there's alpha acids, there's beta acids, and there are other oils. And these are the acids and oils that the brewers are looking for. It's what's giving different recipes a certain amount of flavor. It's what's giving good aromatic smell to them. It's also what's giving kind of good bittering notes to it. Some can also contain different aromas. Some varieties will mature earlier than others, so they might mature, say, the 1st or 2nd week of August. Some may even mature a bit later. Other varieties of hops can also be more adapted for cool climates too. What you find is that different varieties contain a different percentage of acids in the oils within them, and that's certainly important when it comes to deciding on your variety, is looking at the acids, both alpha and beta, and then determining how it's going to be used in the recipe. Because some may be more suited for different types of beer, basically. So different IPAs, different kinds of brewing processes is when they're deciding on these, what cones to use and what cones not to use. So some things to consider when thinking about a variety then. You, of course, want to consider the climate. So those that grow well in the Midwest, a lot of the recommendations and variety recommendations from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, along with Ohio State, are very good for us because the hops varieties are growing in this area. Sometimes it's hard to grow the same varieties recommended out in the Yakima Valley area in Washington just because our climate's very different. There are also some varieties that are pretty good for low trellis. Particularly, University of Minnesota has been doing a lot of work when it comes to figuring out what varieties can grow well on a low trellis. And when I talk about low trellis, I still am talking about 10 feet tall trellis. So I'm not talking about 5 feet. I'm talking about something that's about 10 feet and sometimes to 15 feet. The low trellis system does require a lot more work. It requires a lot more pruning that you need to do and to be a little bit more proactive when it comes to the management of your hops. But there are varieties out there that do very well in the area when it comes to a low trellis system. You also want to consider your hops demand, especially if you're wanting to sell. And this is where you need to do a little bit of groundwork for yourself. If you're in an area that has home brewers, groups that meet once a month, if there are microbreweries in the area, you might reach out to them and start seeing what kind of varieties of hops they're using. And that can give you an idea of what your clientele might be interested in. Especially knowing that it takes a good 3 years to establish them, you don't want to be planting, say, a hops variety that no one has heard about, that no one uses, that people aren't interested whatsoever in it. You want to do one that people are using often and are interested in getting locally sourced too. That's especially important. The last three categories, the alpha, the beta, and the good storage ability, all three of these are things that you're going to find when you start looking for hops rhizomes to purchase. You're going to see a listing that says the alpha acids is this percent, the beta acids is this percent. This hops variety is good for good storage ability. This one isn't good for, it has poor storage ability. So all three of those last factors you'll start to see, you'll find out information on. So what do I mean by that? For alpha acids, each alpha acid, we have about 3 major and several minors. And these are really ratio dependent on the variety. When we think about a high alpha, we think about 12 to 19%. When we think about a low alpha, sometimes this gets below 4 and a 5%. But in essence, the alpha acids are very vital when it comes to certain brewing processes. The beta acids are on kind of the opposite side. They'll have a very similar percent to alpha acids. In fact, there's going to be some hops varieties that have very similar alpha acids as they do beta acids. But beta acids are giving that bitter flavor. And then you also want to look for a good storage ability. And so this is the percent of alpha acids after 6 months of storage. And what I mean by good storage ability is that there are some hops cones that once you dry them, vacuum pack them, you can freeze them at a certain temperature up to 6 months without them losing much of their alpha acid content. This is especially a good approach if you want to maybe not have to sell all of your fresh cones as soon as you pick them. If you have a variety that has really good storage ability, you might consider freezing them and then slowly be able to sell them to home brewers and to breweries in the area the next couple of months by knowing that variety is good for storage. Some other things to consider, I've kind of mentioned most of these already, just knowing what our climate is like, where we live, utilize a lot of the Midwest research and what they're kind of saying and recommended. Also being considerate of that 3-year mark for full establishment. Also, to kind of bring this up right here, if you are a pumpkin grower, if you grow melons, if you grow squash, and you're dependent on this crop each year, and that's what you mainly do, be very mindful of getting involved in hops production because downy and powdery mildew can cross-contaminate with all of these crops. And it can become a very large problem, especially for hops, because the powdery and downy mildew, they can get into the rhizome and cause your crop to have substantial losses the next year, sometimes even potentially kill it. So just kind of be mindful of where you're even setting up your operation. And in fact, there's a lot of hops varieties that are now very resistant to downy and powdery mildew. And so you might consider those if you are just a regular market grower and just want to put out some hops plants. So some recommendations then from some of the Midwest schools. Through some variety trials of University of Minnesota, these are a number of ones that they recommend. This includes Cascade, which is kind of it's kind of the one we hear a lot of talk about. A lot of people, brewers and growers themselves, really recommend Cascade as it performs really well across the board. It also has very similar alpha and beta acids. We also have Nugget, Chinook, Brewer's Gold, and Newport. All of them have been recommended by University of Minnesota, and this is now, I think, their 3rd year of this variety trial. There's also a number of them that are disease tolerant, so this includes Newport, Mount Rainier, Spalt Select, Liberty, and Tradition. You'll note that a number of these disease tolerant ones are kind of new to the scene. We haven't heard too much about them, and some of them may also be included in the club selection. So it may be that you need to join a club in order to get access to some of these hop varieties. So just kind of be on the lookout for that. Whereas other ones, such as Cascade, Nugget, Chinook, Brewer's Gold, and Newport, many of these are kind of readily available. Some additional ones from Michigan then. They recommend Horizon, Sterling, Liberty, Willamette, Centennial, which is also sometimes very popular, as popular sometimes as Cascade is. We also have Chinook, Fugal, Golden, Holotor, Northern Brewer, and Sass. These are the ones that they recommend that perform pretty well in Michigan fields and particularly well with a lot of the Michigan growers there. So lots of overlap, of course, with some of the University of Minnesota ones that have been recommended. So I want to kind of talk a bit about some of the ones that have already been mentioned. So when you go and you start looking for your hops rhizomes, you're going to find this information about the alpha and the beta acids. And so you see I start kind of here with Cascade, where I have an alpha about 4.5 to 7. I have a beta about 4.5 to 7 too. So both my alpha and my beta acids are pretty even. You'll also note that this one kind of matures the first 3 weeks of August. So if you're considering having a number of different hops varieties, there are some that may mature later on into August or some that may mature into September. So you could potentially be harvesting Cascade for the first 3 weeks and then move into another hops variety in the next couple of weeks as well. That's something to kind of consider when you're growing these hops, is kind of staggering some of the harvest depending on the varieties that you're growing. You also note that Cascade is also good for tolerating alkaline soils, especially above 7. Centennial is about 9.5 to 11.5% alphas. We also have a 3.5 to 4.5 beta. What's interesting about Centennial is that typically we see it having almost double the alpha acids of Cascade. But you'll also note it can be fussier about soil types, and it also has a low resistance to downy mildew, so it can be hit pretty hard when it comes to downy mildew. Chinook has about 10 to 14% alpha acids, and the beta about 3 to 4%. You'll also note that some hops varieties have slow dormancy emergence, so it takes them sometimes a bit of time to really emerge in the spring and to put out some good green growth. And of course, that's going to be very seasonal. It's going to really depend on how our winters are, if we have any sort of late frost in the area. You also note it has pretty good vigor and yield compared to others. Mildew and pest resistance is pretty good compared to others as well. Nugget is one that can grow pretty well in sandy soils, but Nugget's also one that we really recommend as far as like a raised bed, a raised row almost. So kind of raising up the bed a bit as you would growing some of your other vegetables, so that the water drains much easier. So this is just kind of a clip from Great Lakes Hops company. There are numerous hops companies out there to buy your rhizomes from. We do not endorse any particular company whatsoever, but I just use their example so that you can see what information you get when you start looking for the varieties. So you'll note we've already touched a bit on alpha acids and beta acids, and here in this kind of catalog entry for Cascade, you note it lists those as well. It also is listing the beer styles. It's saying that this Cascade variety is good for these beer styles. And that's something that, if you're thinking about growing hops for the home brewers and the breweries in your area, you maybe want to go to them and kind of say, these are a couple of varieties I'm looking at doing, and I just want to make sure that I'm choosing them so that they are matching up with the beer style that you make, and kind of see where there can be some overlap there. You also note too that there can sometimes be substitutes. The substitutes being that sometimes the alpha and beta acids are very similar across the board, or it might be that one of these substitutes is also pretty good for disease tolerance compared to another. You also see in this information good storage stability. You'll note with Cascade that it's pretty poor, has less than 60 to 65 alpha acids remaining when it is kind of in the refrigerator condition as well. So to kind of just get you thinking that this is the information that you're going to see when you start looking for varieties. So when you're establishing hops, you see rhizomes that can be purchased through online websites and other companies. In these photos, you see the rhizomes. So they kind of come looking almost like little tiny logs, and you plant them in the spring. A lot of times you can also, if you get them earlier than you intended to have them and you still got frost on the ground, then you maybe can establish them in pots and then from there move them out once you're free of frost. You can also order field-ready hop plants. field-ready rhizomes. And that's something that we did up here in Freeport, Illinois, when we were trying to do a little test batch of growing hops. Was we actually got field-ready hops ready to go. So as soon as they came in, I was able to kind of turn around and plant them into the soil. When your rhizomes come in, you also want to keep them slightly moistened, and the best way to do this is to keep them in the fridge until they're ready to be planted. In Illinois, as I just kind of touched on, you can start these indoors if you get them a bit too early, and it just gives them a head start in growth. But in most cases, you're going to plant them in the ground in late April to early May, even a couple weeks after that early May date, as soon as kind of you're free of that danger of frost, is when you would plant them that first year. Additionally, you're planting about one rhizome per hill with the buds pointed up, and then you're going to cover that with about 1 inch of soil. It's important to really make sure that you have your right spacing set up. And typically you're going to see about 3 feet apart if you're using the same variety in the row, and then you want to do 5 feet apart if it's going to be a different variety. And then you'll have if you have a couple of rows, you'll want to do about 8 feet apart. And this just allows for good air circulation. It allows for you to really manage your hops too, and so there's not any confusion as to what hops you have and where they're being planted. You also want to consider mulching heavily because hops and their foliage tend to drink a lot of water and need a lot of water, especially in the growing season. I've been surprised as we've established some of them up in Freeport that I feel like I've watered them enough, and then a couple hours later I go to check again, and it's dry as a bone. So they are plants that really require a lot of water, and so by doing some kind of mulch, you can kind of help keep that moisture in. Some additional thing to consider, especially when establishment, is kind of knowing that well-drained, deep, sandy loam soils are ideal. You also want to kind of avoid heavy, poorly drained soils. Hops do not like to sit in wet water. They do not like to sit in wet soil. So you want to be kind of mindful of that, especially depending on your soil type. Once you know your soil type, that can give you a better idea of what varieties to choose as well, because some perform much better on sandy soils, whereas some may be much better on other silt soils. You also want to consider about a pH of 6 to 7, which is ideal. And if you're establishing a large acreage or a large area, we always recommend getting that soil test, because that's going to give you a really great idea of what your pH is, along with what your soil organic matter is, and any of those other nutrients. A basic fertilization recommendation that has come from some of the other states has been to amend the soil with additional composted fertilizer each spring. This can be done kind of in between the hops plant that you have, or even kind of on the outside of the rhizome itself. You might also consider doing additional nitrogen, about a half a tablespoon of 2100 per plant in June, especially as we know as the soil temperatures start warming up. With the rhizome itself, it's going to start needing a lot more nitrogen. Hops are pretty big feeders of nitrogen as well, so you want to also monitor nutrients through yearly soil tests and foliar samples. This is especially important if you're putting out, say, an acre of hops or a large amount of plantings. You need to be very mindful of the nitrogen that it needs to do so. So like I said, with the watering, hops have this very large leaf area, and they really need significant water requirements. We'll talk about irrigation in the next couple slides, but in most cases you want to water plants every 1 to 3 days. And in a typical season, the hops field will require about 20 to 30 inches of water. It's a very vigorous plant, as you can imagine. If the vine is going up 20 to 30 feet, it will need a lot of water so that it can start yielding and can start getting good growth. In most cases, we also recommend doing a drip irrigation or a soaker hose, because this is really better for discouraging disease growth. When you have irrigation and you're spraying it on the plant itself, you're more liable to spread downy and powdery mildews among the rest of your field. So by doing drip irrigation or the soaker hose method, it's going right at the base of that rhizome. Additionally, established hop plants will typically require about 1.5 feet of water equivalent per week. This is based on kind of a Rutgers recommendation, or 1.5 inches rather. It's most critical for the hop growth stages. So really, early spring to mid-April is really when we see a lot of water needed by the hops, just to kind of get going and get off the ground. We also see just prior to and through the flowering period in early July. That's really where we see a lot of water needs from the hops plant. So the two systems we generally see with hop yard is the soaker hose method. We also tend to see the drip irrigation method. So the drip irrigation is just a tube where there's a small emitter, so many inches or so many feet, and it's going right at the base of the plant itself, and so then the plant is able to take up the water. It allows us to have a little bit better control over weed control, along with not wasting as much water either, just because the water is going right at the base of the plant and not really getting on the foliage. There's a fantastic YouTube video from the University of Vermont extension program that really goes into the heart of kind of the irrigation setup and what you need to consider when you're getting things set up. So highly recommend looking at that video, especially if you're thinking about getting into multiple acres or even 1 acre of hops production and figuring out what the irrigation system needs to look like. There's also some information from them as well that kind of gives you an idea of like, so say I have 0.75 acres of a hops yard and I need to set up an irrigation system. What are the items that I need for this? And what are the things I need to consider and not consider when I'm getting this set up? So you can see here that, for them, 0.75 acre system, they set up for about $1,800. And this, of course, is dependent on what they were growing and kind of how their yard was set up too. And of course, they're factoring in labor at the bottom though. But certainly look at that PDF because that will give a good idea of what the irrigation system can look like and what the irrigation system can be kind of set up as. We also have some information from Michigan with Dr. Rob Sarin, who's kind of been spearheading a lot of the hops work within Michigan. And so he kind of did some research that you can find kind of here at this link. You'll note it's coming through the University of Vermont, but you can also go through Michigan State and find this research study. But he was just kind of looking at if we have emitters every 2 feet, so knowing that, you should be planting hops every 3 feet or every 5 feet, he has an output of about 0.42 gallon per hour, but also is using a soil moisture-based system. He found that there was about a higher initial cost, but tend to be somewhat more efficient in the setup if you're setting up, say, an acre or 2 of hops. So when it comes to disease management, we're primarily concerned with powdery and downy mildew. Powdery mildew we see as kind of fluffy white fungus that overwinters in root crowns, which is sometimes what our concern is that not only is the powdery fungus getting on the leaf tissue, but we can also get it inside the root crowns or the rhizomes of the hops plants, because it can then spread to leaves and cones as the season progresses. If we have an outbreak of powdery mildew in late June or early July, when hops are in full bloom, the cones may not develop properly. It could also reduce our yield, and it could also reduce the quality of the cones themselves. So here's a couple of photos of what the powdery mildew looks like. You'll note that, and especially in that bottom photo of just the leaf tissue, kind of flecks of white, discoloring of yellow, and then you can also see the powdery mildew on the cones itself. So in this case, you can harvest them, but you cannot sell them because it has the fungus in it. The yields are not good. It's messed up all the lupulin glands and the alpha and beta acids that you are hoping to sell for the home brewers and the other breweries in your area. But it's just kind of something to consider that, when you're getting into investment of hops, there's going to be disease problems, especially with some of the powdery and downy mildews. Downy mildew, on the other hand, tends to appear in the spring. As the shoot becomes infected, then you sometimes have lower leaves become blackened with spores. This is also one that can overwinter in infected hop crowns. So be very mindful of if you get downy or powdery mildew during your season, be very mindful of how it getting any leaf tissue away from that crown so that the hops plant so the fungus won't overwinter in the crown. There are some varieties that will develop the crown infection from the downy mildew, and this can actually result in kind of the crown or the hops plant rhizome dying during winter. The management side of it, managing for downy and powdery mildew, is really allowing for good airflow. There's a photo I'll show you in the next couple of slides that some people will remove the lower 2 to 3 feet of the leaf tissue of hops once the hops plant has reached, say, 15 to 20 feet. And that allows for some pretty good airflow to move through. There are also sometimes some preventative fungicides available when these issues become apparent. But as I mentioned too, being mindful of your water, watering at the base of the plant or having a drip irrigation so that it doesn't tend to spread among the rest of your hop field. So you can see with this photo of downy mildew, kind of black underneath the leaf structure itself, blackish, brownish. You almost have a bit of a soot type look to it as well. And in essence, it is hitting the leaf tissues. It's keeping them from actively doing photosynthesis and can result into kind of lower yields of your hops and even spread to your hop cones. Here's some additional photos from Michigan State University. So you can see with this green tissue where the brown is kind of spread to these leaf structures, whereas with the hops cones on the right, it's hit the cones itself. So you cannot harvest these cones. You can remove them, you can harvest them rather, but you cannot sell these. They are completely not going to work for the operation anymore. So just be kind of mindful of both of those diseases, downy and powdery mildew, as you're getting your plants established. And as I said, sometimes we have good seasons and sometimes we have pretty bad seasons. It is really depending a lot of times on the environmental conditions that we have. Some additional things that you might see as far as the insect side is you might have some pest issues. So a lot of times we see two-spotted spider mite and aphids, along with Japanese beetles, as being sometimes the nuisance on many of the hops cones themselves. So mites will tend to puncture leaf tissue. They can destroy, damaging the cones, and then we get this reddish-brown discoloration. So it's what you see over here on the right in this photo from USDA. Is this brown discoloration of the hops cone. They also tend to thrive in hot and dry conditions. So that if we have a period in the summer where it's fairly hot and fairly dry, we might see some spider mite problems. There can be some control, insecticidal soaps, water blasts, as well as some other insecticides that are available, especially if spider mites begin to get out of hand and you start to get a lot more problems. With most of the insects we even talk about, though, we always recommend an integrated pest management plan. So doing some insect scouting early on in the season to then determine if there needs to be any kind of chemical control with the hops management. So kind of additional photo just kind of showing you what some additional damage on leaf itself can look like from the two-spotted spider mite. Aphids can also be another problem, and these you're going to note will be on a lot of times on the underside of the leaf. So in the top right corner you see the yellow and white insects. Those are our aphids. They feed directly on the plants, extracting cell sap. They also have a high population that will reduce the yields and weaken the plants. We also can sometimes have sooty mold, and that can grow on the honeydew excreted and reduce the quality of the cones itself. So you can see in this bottom photo of the hops cone that there's brown discoloration, there's bits of black and sooty mold that's coming from the actual aphid and the damage that it's doing. Another insect that can be highly destructive is the Japanese beetle. This is one where some seasons it's good and some seasons it is not. And you can see in this photo here, a lot of defoliation occurs with the Japanese beetle. The same damage that you see on all different kinds of other vegetables and fruit crops you see on hops plants. And as you can imagine, you've got a 20, 30 foot long vine with good vegetation, and that's all the Japanese beetle needs, is that good vegetation start going to town. So it's one that you kind of have to be mindful of as the season goes along. Sometimes sprays may be needed for both throughout the season, especially during the bloom time and later in the season as the cones ripen. I've also met with other growers, especially in Wisconsin, where sometimes there can be some pretty good trap crops. I know, for instance, one of them just had a smaller area of grapes, and the Japanese beetles were going to the grapes instead of the hops. Granted, I think he wanted to get grape yields that year, but he saw in that situation that there was a bit of a trap crop and could potentially even things out. Weeds, like their issues with all other vegetables and fruit, can reduce yields. This is especially true with those first 2 years. You're trying to establish the crop. It's trying to get the energy it needs. It's trying to really develop the rhizome itself. And if you have weeds in there, they now can potentially outcompete your rhizome. They also can be notorious for interfering with your drip irrigation system. You'll note that most of the drip irrigation systems for hop yards, the irrigation is not buried underneath the soil. It's really kind of at the base around the plant itself. We don't typically see drip irrigation planted on their plastic culture systems either. So you have this irrigation line that's fairly open to the weather and to the environmental conditions, along with potentially being altered by any weed problems you have. With most weed issues as well, they host insects, plants, they can also other pathogens, and can really impede the harvest that you have too. Um, Between rows, typically managing by cultivation, even between plants, sometimes you can really be useful as far as just cultivating those by hand. There also can be some herbicides available if weeds become a pretty noxious problem. So then the trellising system. There's two kind of different kinds of trellising systems out there, or just different kinds of products available to you, rather. So some people use coconut fiber. There's jute, which is a kind of a trellis, kind of a fibrous compound, very similar to coconut fiber that some people use. Some people use paper, or you might do a poly support string. And basically, this twine is going to start at the base of the rhizome. You're going to anchor it right near your hops plant, and you're going to run it all the way up to the top of your plant. And the idea is that come harvest time, I'm going to cut it at the bottom where my plant is, and then I'm going to cut it at the top where the rest of my plant is, and remove that whole vine. But hops need a wire. They need some kind of wire to go up all the way to the top of the trellis. You'll also note the height of the wire is really dependent on the ease of harvest. So some people, maybe they want to do a low trellis system, so they might have a wire that just goes to 10 feet, and then once it reaches 10 feet, it may cascade over. Otherwise, you want to set up a system where the wire can go as tall as your trellis system is. So if your trellis system is, 30 feet, you want a wire or a fiber or a paper or a string that goes all the way up there as well. But really 10 feet is that minimum. You'll also note with this photo of Rutgers, kind of getting back to what we talked about with weeds, that there's a little bit of weed pressure within the rows, and it's kind of a common practice that we see sometimes where people are, once the vines have maybe reached a certain height, they may decide to kind of give up on the spraying or give up on the removal of the weed plants. So this is a photo from Ontario that looks very similar to what we saw with North Carolina State with the actual kind of V style of stringing. So each side of that V is just one vine, and that's going all the way up onto your tall trellis system. So when I'm ready to harvest my crop, I'm going to come through at the bottom and cut that vine and then cut again at the top as well. You might also design your hop yard so that if you have any type of machinery, you can kind of get through that yard as well. For instance, you can see here that, they have a grass path. So maybe they are harvesting, so they're cutting the grass in between that row. They also may have a picker that is the same size of that row as well. But the idea, especially with some of this V system, is it really allows for a lot more air circulation to occur. Not to say that the other designs where you have just a singular row of hops don't work as well. It's just that within this system, sometimes you can get a bit more airflow than you would otherwise. So some other things to consider when you're thinking about a trellis system, especially when you're expecting to grow a number of different varieties. The majority of hops are going to be trained on tall trellises. That's 18 to 21 feet to really maximize the yields. You also need to consider that tall wire trellis has to be able to really withstand a lot of weight, particularly about 35 pounds per plant, and also be able to kind of be mindful of what the wind is as well. Michigan State has a great handout for construction requirements of the trellis system. Gives you an idea of what to consider as well as what are the costs that need to go into setting that up. So highly recommend looking at that resource. And as I said, as it's mentioned here with Vermont, you can also find it at MSU. And there will be a link at the end of today to get that. Another idea to consider, though, is that you can do a single pole trellising system. So you can see here that they have set up a TP-like trial with their hops. And this is especially good if you are wanting to try out a couple of different varieties. This can give you an idea of what the yields might look like without having to set up an entire field or without having to set up, an entire necessarily structure for your hops. You'll note that in each kind of corner of these is a single rhizome and a single vine. You'll also even note you can kind of barely see it right behind the first TP on your right. There's one right back there that just has the strings itself. But this can be a pretty good idea as far as just seeing how the plants do, the varieties do, and perform well in the area, along with not always having to make a commitment for a very large-scale hops yard. You can kind of try these varieties out, see what works and what doesn't work, and then from there be able to decide to scale up. This can also be fairly good for you if you're a market grower and are selling at farmers markets. You just have a little bit of space. You might be able to kind of set up a hops TP system. So hops are going to grow clockwise in direction. And so from the rhizome, as we've touched on, you wait until the vines are about a foot long, and then you choose about 2 to 3 of the most vigorous shoots to grow, and then you will then remove all the remaining shoots. And what you're going to note, though, is that you're still later on in your season, even after you've chosen these 2 to 3 vigorous shoots, you're still going to have shoots coming up. That's just notorious. That's just kind of what the game is that there are still going to be shoots coming up. And you'll want to remove all those other ones that keep coming up as your season goes along. As the shoots start elongating, as the vines start elongating, you want to start kind of training them on support structure by winding them in a clockwise direction. And as I say, the hops vines are going to do this naturally. The shoots will do this naturally. It's just a matter of kind of training them up this paper vine or coconut shoot vine to the height that of your trellis system. What you'll also find is about 20 feet, that's really where the side shoots will grow side branches, and this is where the cones will be produced. So I know I've already mentioned about the low trellis system of being 10 to 15 feet. So with the low trellis system, you'll be doing some excessive pruning and kind of be very mindful of the hops plant itself, and it will also end up having to kind of cascade over that 10 feet and go on the other side of it. So here's from Ontario as well, just very similar to what we see with other ones today. But you can also note in this picture, especially on the left-hand corner, you can start to see the vines start kind of going around the coconut jute or the paper trellis. And that's something that, as you're walking your hop yard and maybe the shoot is not really connecting with the paper jute or the coconut fiber, you want to just kind of be mindful and kind of manage them to kind of naturally do that. But in most cases, once you start training them, especially into the first season, and each season after that, they should be pretty good, especially once they've reached about 1 to 2 feet. So something that some growers will do is actually do some pruning. You'll note in this photo from North Carolina State that they will actually prune the lower 2 to 3 feet of the foliage. And this is especially helpful when it comes to some disease pressure you might run into, like downy or powdery mildew. Because the plant itself is sending all its growth upwards and no longer really focusing on the bottom part, but it's really developing the cones, we can kind of begin to strip some of this. And this can kind of help with the more airflow that you might need as you're growing your hops plants. So after harvest, we're cutting the vines off the trellis. If you want to get into propagation, there's a method where you can actually leave about 2 feet of that vine above the ground, and then you're going to kind of bury it a few inches deep in a trench. And this will then produce buds and shoots that can be used for propagation next year. I haven't delved too much into the hops propagation, nor have I seen too many growers get into it, but it certainly is a method that can be done, and it will kind of be a little more experimenting more than anything to see if it will work. Also, of course, it will be kind of more dependent on the environmental issues and the seasonality of the thing. And even with there at the end, I kind of talk about 12 to 20 years of productive life is what we see out of a good hops plant. So when are you going to harvest them? Cones are mature when a number of ways, and it all is a feel test and a smell test. I've talked with other growers in the area and with some in other states of like, is this true? Is there any other way you can tell you can tell? And they all say it kind of comes down to this, that you should feel the hop cone itself should feel soft. It should have a little slightly damp to the touch, but you should also kind of squeeze it a bit, and it should kind of like spring back a bit. You also will have a strong aroma, so that what we consider that hoppy smell is that strong aroma. You also will have kind of a golden yellow color with sticky residue. So it should almost be that some of the lupulin glands and powder are kind of coming out of the cones themselves. Most of the time, if we have a normal growing season, August to September is typically when we see hops available, and hops need to be harvested. But this is really dependent on variety. As I talked about, there can be early dates, early varieties, there can be late varieties as well. You have a couple of options for your cone harvest. You want to remove the whole vines when the cones are ready. And this is one where if you have acres and acres of hops, you want to consider kind of getting some machinery to do this that could maybe just strip off the cones. But in most cases, you're going to harvest by hand. So you'll cut those vines down, and then you will remove the cones from them. You also, as I kind of recommend with this, when you're determining if they're ready to be harvested, you don't want to just harvest the ones that are closest to you. You almost want to take a sample of different ones throughout that vine, so that you're not just harvesting this whole vine and all of a sudden you realize that half of these are mature, half of these are not mature, and you've made a mistake and lost some of those cones. So be very kind of mindful of that when you're harvesting it. As we talk about hand harvesting, utilizing a ladder or other structures, especially kind of cutting at the base and cutting at the top, you need to get a ladder, especially if you've got any kind of, if you have a trellis system that's really tall. So you've harvested them. Now what are you going to do next? You can sell cones a certain way, hop cones a certain way. There are some breweries and home brewers who like wet cones, and these are the undried hop cones. So I, for instance, may harvest them this morning, and then I will sell them to the brewery in the afternoon. I've seen that happen before. I saw it happen with my grows this past summer. So that's where you already kind of have the clientele in place, and your harvest is ready, and maybe they're ready to start brewing. The other method is the drying method. So this is a process where you will dry your cones down to 8 to 10% moisture level. And this is kind of determined through a subsample. So you're taking a sample of the cones that you have. You begin to dry them down to 0% moisture or 8 to 10% moisture level. And then from there, that can give you an idea of how you need to dry them. And I highly recommend University of Minnesota's hops drying calculator. That's what you really need to utilize because it allows you to kind of plug in the numbers, the different weights, the different moisture levels, and can give you a really good grasp and idea of how long you need to dry them and to get to the 8 to 10 moisture level. When we talk about drying cones, it doesn't have to be a very large process either. I've seen people who will pick their cones and dry them out on a window screen and kind of turn them over every couple of days or up to a week. But that's when they also are kind of knowing what the moisture level content is as well. Some people will even have specially made machinery just for harvesting the cones. And then these are going to be stored or either sold directly to the consumer at that moment. So some of them, as we touched on, have good storage ability. So they're going to be they can be frozen through vacuum packed once they've been vacuum packed. You also, if you get into large scale hops production, you see a lot of them that are actually baled cones. What you'll also note too is that when you pick the cones, they're in their whole cone state. There are cones out there, hops cones that are pelletized. The only problem is that a pelletizing system to pelletize hops is a very expensive piece of machinery. So getting started with growing hops for market, you want to just be marketing them as either wet cones or as dry cones. So for instance, with this photo you see here, someone has Cascade hops, they've grown, they've vacuum sealed it, and then they have also labeled it as 3 ounces of Cascade. And that's especially important when you start harvesting them, is how do you want to sell them and package them? Because some home brewers may just need 5 ounces of Cascade, or they may just need, 8 ounces of Nugget, perchance. Whereas maybe a microbrewery will need maybe 4 or 5 pounds of a certain amount of cones. So that's kind of important too, is to figuring out what certain increments that you want to package your cones in. So then to wrap up, just a couple of acknowledgments. Candace Miller is a horticulture educator within my office, and she's been very helpful when it comes to our hops production program, and she and I have co-taught both of the hops programs I mentioned on the first slide. A couple of other good guides out there for you. Some of the Rutgers information from New Jersey has some very good publications. With Minnesota, Vince Fritz is doing a lot of the main hops research there. He also has some really good hops summary from 2013. Roy has a good summary of the hops yield, variety trials, things like that. So that lab has been doing a lot of the good research in Minnesota. With Michigan State, Dr. Rob Siren with hops, michiganstate.edu, is where you can find a number of the Michigan resources I'd mentioned to you today about. They also have a pretty good one when it comes to fertilizers and nutrient management for hops. Additionally, Vermont, with the Vermont Hops program, does a lot of great work as far as some of the trellising systems, the irrigation. You'll also note there's really 2 good guides from Heather Darby, Fertility Guide for Hops in the Northeast, as well as nitrogen management in hops as well. So that being said, that concludes today's webinar. I am going to open the chat box and kind of see what the questions have been. That's also my contact information too, so feel free to email me if you have any questions about today's webinar or anything else you're curious about. As I kind of mentioned too, I've already done 2 hops programs previously, and one of them goes strictly into nutrient management and irrigation. So if you're very curious about that topic, I'd be happy to send you information for that. All right, so the first question came from Kurt, and Kurt asked, what is the acreage these stats are based on? And so I believe he was asking about the average, the yield I was giving of about, well, I can't get to right now, 0.2 to 2 pounds of hops per plant. And that was coming from some Minnesota data. And typically that's about 1,400 plants per acre is where they got that average of 0.2 to 2 pounds of hops per plant. Then second question comes from James. Can we use a cover crop between rows as well to manage weeds? Yes, you can use a cover crop. In fact, there's been a lot of study and a lot of interest with some of the low-lying clovers to be used between rows, especially because there's a lot of need for nitrogen in the growing season. So they're kind of seeing hops as being clover as being a pretty good cover crop because it can address some of those nitrogen needs and kind of balance out some of the fertilizers. I haven't seen any of the other grasses being used like cereal rye or wheat or oats like that, but certainly we've seen a lot of adoption so far of clover. So those are the only 2 questions I have. Does anyone else have any other questions? Please feel free to kind of put, let's see. Is there a commercial financial model available through? Yes, Troy. I would recommend going through Michigan State. I know that I believe they have a model that's available. If you'll email me as well, and I can kind of connect you with some of the resources I have for that too. But especially when it comes to kind of, establishing a hops yard, what is the actual finances you need to go into that? I believe it's Michigan State that has a pretty good resource. Could you explain the process again about cutting the vine and burying it and why? All right. For some people who want to add hops plants to their operations without having to add the plants, without having to purchasing the plants each year, they might decide to kind of leave 2 feet of that rhizome and then kind of plant it into the soil, and then that will kind of propagate it from there. Because this is a rhizome and all those shoots can at some time be established as new plants, this is kind of the best method that they do. You don't always have to do it. In fact, if you are just growing hops and you don't always need to do it. But for some people who are wanting to maybe scale up each year, they might consider kind of propagating that method. But again, it still is a gray area which I'm a little unfamiliar with, and we don't see the adoption of it often. All right, so Deborah has included the Michigan Hops Cost of Production Bulletin in the chat box. So that's the guide I was mentioning. Thank you very much, Deborah. All right, so the question is, what kind of alternative spacing can be used in the grid versus row planting? So that's a very good question. I think in most cases you need to go by, the 3 feet between the same variety, the 5 feet between different varieties. But as far as 8 feet, that's just strictly based on that grid type system. So if you have a smaller space and you can get away with different forms of spacing size, you can certainly do that. I think there's ability to sometimes even tighten the rows a bit more and get more yield that way. So reducing that 8-foot row, I think you could certainly do that. Whereas the grid system and a lot of the V systems you see, they're kind of set up for production with heavy equipment. So they're the ones that, the photos I've shown you today, it's for those operations that have that equipment. So if you don't have the equipment, which can be very costly, you can really get away with some different alternative spacing ideas, as long as you really get back to that heart of that 3 feet and 5-foot rule between varieties. Does that answer your question, Teacup Farm? Yeah, I mean, I think certainly a hoop tunnel could potentially be an option. It really is going to really depend on the weight of that structure, whether or not it can support it. Especially knowing that each rhizome really needs about 35 pounds of support, you kind of be really cautious of if that structure is able to do it. I think certainly if you have good ventilation, if you're able to do some drip irrigation in there, you might kind of play around with it and see if it works. But I would still be kind of cautious, especially the weight of the hops plant themselves. I could also see where it could be pretty beneficial as far as just any issues with downy and powdery mildew. There we go. So Mike Rogie chimes in. Yes, if they don't have good poor ventilation, then really the powdery and downy mildew is going to be kind of a problem. Thank you, Mike. All right. Chloe asks, in the new season, what needs to be done to the old crops from last year to get them started in the new year? So if you're growing hops, you want to just make sure kind of that green growth is removed from last year. Most cases, if it's under snow right now, you're going to be fine. You don't necessarily need to kind of rejuvenate them in the spring. But if you've got any kind of old growth, my recommendation would be to go ahead and remove that, just because there could be any number of funguses, diseases that it got in the last year that now is overwintering and could go into that crown and rhizome that we talked about. Yes, yes. So if you have hops that you grew this past summer, the best thing you can do right now is to remove last year's growth. So prune to that base and mulch would be your best bet, just to kind of get more, kind of get it ready for next year. All right. Well, if you have any more questions, feel free to email me, gmccarty@illinois.edu. And like we said, you will see a recorded version of this, and I'm always happy to share other information with you as well, too. And with that, thank you all for attending, and have a very good day.